Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Todd. Welcome to the new and improved Dr. Todd Show. In this first episode, we're going to be talking about the experience of being the proxy, and I'm going to be using a lot of my own story of what it was like growing up in an effigistic household, and in my struggle to figure out what that experience really was and how I finally came to develop this whole concept of Effigism. So let's get rolling. So my story in the discovery of Effigism started in 1983 when I was living in an abandoned house and was a hardcore drug addict and was literally using to die. I weighed about 140 pounds, 150 pounds. I mean, I had a little 28-inch waist, and for someone who's 6'2", that's pretty emaciated. In fact, I had a pair of shorts at the time that had a 28-inch waist that I would wear often, and I had found this stuffed dog, the stuffed animal, and those shorts fit the stuffed animal. That's how small I was at the time. And I was literally like probably a couple weeks from death when I finally had some kind of awakening. Something clicked in me. I had what I can only describe as some form of spiritual awakening or moment of clarity, or there's something that was very transformative that happened on September 10th of 1983. And that was the point where I got sober. I've been clean ever since then, so it's been almost 43 years now. And that also was the moment when I decided that I was going to do whatever I needed to do. I didn't care if it killed me. I was willing to do anything to become the best person that I could, to recover and to get out of the mess that I was in. And at the time, I was functionally illiterate. I mean, I could read stop signs and I could read words on a page, but I had graduated high school with a 1.9 GPA, and that was just a gift that they gave me just to get me out of the high school system because I was such a mess up. And I went from being this dude who had trouble at times speaking in full sentences and simply could not even read a magazine article, to getting 2 doctorate degrees and writing several books and all of that. But that was only through just a tremendous amount of work and searching and opening up and being vulnerable and exploring and trying whatever I could to heal. And from the very beginning, I remember there was just this constant sense of I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I liked. I didn't know what I didn't like. I had no passion. I didn't, the only thing that I knew I could do is I knew how to drive, and I was a really kind of pathetic hack guitar player who played in a couple of high school bands, but really was pretty lousy at it. But other than that, it's like I felt helpless. I felt disoriented. I felt depressed. I just felt like I didn't deserve to live. I felt like if people really knew who I was, they would hate me, because that had been my experience. That as soon as I really opened up to somebody or somebody started getting close to me, they would realize what a broken, sick, and horrible person I am, and I would be rejected. And that had been my experience. And I didn't really know how to make sense of that at the time. And so all of that was really internalized as my identity. I just felt like I was one of those people that the universe just decided was going to be a throwaway person, right? That there was somehow the world had conspired to put me into this state of failure, this state of collapse, and that I was just the gross, ugly pimple on the butt of the world, and everybody would be happy if I was just eliminated, if I was just gone. And that was really what I believed about myself. And I can remember there were times when I would look at myself in the mirror and I was so alienated from myself that it was almost like I couldn't even recognize the person who I was looking at. The reflection in the mirror, I almost couldn't even recognize that person. I mean, it's like the form was familiar, but it didn't feel like me. It was like there was some imposter in that reflection that wasn't me. I would have just these emotional outbursts where I would be just feeling normal and big air quotes here, normal, right? But I would be feeling relatively calm and stable, and then all of a sudden it was like out of the blue something would just come up and I would just start being flooded, and I would do something like just go out and smash something or pull the mirrors off my car or just do weird stuff, and I didn't understand why. Or all of a sudden I would fixate on making sure one small patch of grass would get watered every day. I mean, it was, looking at it now, it was like nonsensical. But at the time, I just had such a disorientation, and I had so much trauma stuff going on and such an empty sense of self that I was grasping for things and trying to find places where I felt like I belonged or I existed, or find people who would find value in me. And so there were times when I would be like super like giving of myself, trying to save everybody else just so that they would recognize me as being important or having some value, right? It's like by being the rescuer, even though I was the one who needed rescuing, by coming in and trying to rescue somebody else, somehow then, I suppose by proxy, I was trying to save myself. But there was another element that, man, if I do this for them, if I just got this thing that I wanted and I just give it to them, even though they didn't ask for it, then somehow they would recognize that, oh, wow, this guy is really cool. He's a really nice guy. Look at what he did for me. Now I can see him as having some value. And what I found is that for a long time, that need to feel seen, that need to feel valued, that need to have somewhere where I felt like I fit, somewhere where I felt like I belonged, somewhere where I could have some kind of sense of identity. I would oftentimes put myself into situations where I felt like the other people kind of had to accept me or would accept me, because people who are really healthy, it's like they would never want to interact with me. But if I can start with the low ones, right? If I can start with the kind of the entry level people, so to speak, where it's like, they're struggling a bit too. So maybe if I go in and start there and kind of prove how awesome I am to other people who are struggling, then somehow I will start feeling better about myself so that, and I wasn't necessarily consciously thinking this, but I think inside there was this notion that I just need to start somewhere. I just need to find somebody who will value me, who will see me as being good and worthy and awesome and all of that kind of stuff. Just somebody who could recognize some inherent dignity in me and give me some sense of belonging and some sense of value and some sense of identity. And by being useful, I would have like some sense of agency. It's like there was just such a hunger to have someone do that for me that I oftentimes would reach out to the very people who would take advantage of me, reach out to the very people who would further undermine my sense of self. And as long as I was giving, they were happy to take it. But it was much more of a parasitic kind of relationship where they would take as long as I was willing to give. But when I hoped for something in return, nothing ever came. And when I would want to just get together and hang out, they just weren't interested, right? They were only interested in me as far as what I could provide for them, which further undermined my sense of self, right? And just made me feel like I am just the most worthless person ever. See, this is just further proof. Again, here I am trying to reach out to people, and again, here it is that I am just getting the feedback that I don't matter, that I'm unlovable, that nothing that I ever do matters or really makes a difference, and that my only value is just in what I can do for somebody else, because there is just no inherent value in me that people would want to interact with or people would want to connect with. And so there was just this profound sense of isolation and depression and just this all I could describe is just this kind of internal sense of collapse where there's just like this painful vacuum, like somebody just pulled my guts out, and I would just feel this sinking, empty, painful feeling inside my gut most of the time. And because I grew up in an environment where I was not seen, I was not valued, anything that I tried to do was undermined, then it's like I had no concept of what living differently even looked like or felt like. All I knew is that I am stuck in this place where I feel freaking horrible all the time, and I don't know what to do. It's like no matter what I try, it seems to only be like changing seats on the Titanic, right? It's not really getting me off. It's like things are still sinking, things are still going bad, and no matter what I do, it just doesn't seem to work. And I went from, therapist to therapist, and I would read books and all of that. But back in the day, back in the 90s, and even when I was in treatment for a time, my senior year of high school was spent in a treatment center. And then when I got back out, I started using again. And that's when I went into the abandoned house. And that's another story about how that whole thing happened. It's horrible. But, at that time, there was this whole idea of putting people in the hot seat. So as a kid who was really struggling, who had grown up in a family where my sense of self had just been undermined and destroyed, and I was just in a lot of pain. I was confused. I really didn't know how to orient myself to the world. I go into these treatment centers and they would go around the room and everybody be yelling at me about how I'm doing everything wrong. Because at the time in psychology, it was all about, we need to break through your defenses because, the fact that you're all struggling is because you're unwilling to be honest and vulnerable. And the reality is that it was just re-traumatizing. And that whole attitude of just, highly confrontational, you're full of crap and all of this kind of thing that they used to do in treatment and in therapy. Just further reinforce the idea that I'm just a broken and unlovable person and just was re-traumatizing. And so, I went to a number of therapists and, nobody really understood how trauma influences people's lives. I mean, one of the big books on trauma that has come out is The Body Keeps the Score. I mean, obviously there's been some understanding of like trauma and PTSD from kind of soldiers' combat stuff, right? But even that wasn't even officially put into the DSM, what the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that is used for diagnosing mental disorders until the 1980s, right? And that was very narrowly defined and highly controversial, and that was only among soldiers. And so there was just no concept at all that there were these other types of traumas that kids could experience in childhood. And those things could really take a couple forms, right? I mean, there are these attacks that kids could experience where they are sexually assaulted or beat up or yelled at, where there's these overwhelming events where the kid feels trapped and overwhelmed and attacked that would, contribute to a real dysregulation of the nervous system and much more kind of traditional PTSD kinds of symptoms. But there was also this form of trauma where it's like it was all about deprivation. Right? It's like, it doesn't matter whether you die by assault or starvation. They both are lethal, right? And so there's this other form of trauma, which even to this day, a lot of people don't really understand, is this whole idea of depriving the sense of self of even being developed. And you see this in families where there's a lot of emotional neglect, where the kids are just seen as a pawn and the parents are all in their own stuff. You see this a lot when there's addiction in the family, when there's narcissism or Effigism, where the kids' needs are just not met at all. Their emotional needs are not met. And so what ends up happening is that they go through childhood without a well-formed sense of self. And then they go through adolescence, which is a very disruptive time of life. But it's also a time in adolescence where a lot of that early childhood experience becomes kind of wired in, becomes kind of hardwired. Then they enter into adulthood with this real sense of like, I don't know who I am. I can tell you what I can do, right? But I don't really know who I am, or I feel like I'm a constant failure. I feel like I can't do anything right, or I always choose the wrong partners. I always put myself into situations where I'm abused, or somebody takes advantage of me. I end up getting in relationships with partners that are very narcissistic or very effigistic or abusive or ignore me or betray me. And I keep like going into those same patterns over and over again, right? And that's one of the things about about getting through childhood where you have that combination of either kind of traditional trauma, big T trauma, right, where you experience danger and you experience assault, sexual abuse, being raped, being beaten, being constantly yelled at, or because that just creates this terrifying experience, or being threatened, where it's like I could, I might be killed here if I don't adapt. And then there's also the kind of the little T trauma, which is all about chronic deprivation, where our parents just didn't give us what we need because they were so oriented towards themselves that there wasn't an emotional bond that really formed. And so we just kind of went through childhood, without a lot of connection anywhere, right? And for those kids who had an uncle or an aunt or a cousin or a coach or a teacher who really took an interest in them and kind of became a pseudo parent for them, they at least had somebody they could talk to and they could connect with and they could process things through. And that teacher or that whoever that is, that coach, cousin, could give them a sense of who they are and give them a sense that they're okay and be a little bit of a protective mechanism against what was going on in the family. But for many kids like me, there was nobody. There was nobody because the entire family system was pretty chaotic and pretty unhealthy. And so many of the people that you see living under bridges or are homeless really came from homes that were, even if they may have been middle class and were nice and shiny on the outside, on the inside, there was chronic deprivation of the sense of self, oftentimes coupled with some kind of a series of traumatic events. So they kind of struggled with both forms of that trauma. And for whatever reason, I was able to just dedicate my life to getting out of that and figuring out what the hell is going on so that I could get this figured out. And but a lot of people just aren't for whatever reason. And those are the people that you oftentimes see living on the streets or who are, chronic drug addicts who are in prison, who, constantly have failed marriages and struggle and all of that kind of stuff. And I should just, before I go on, I should say too that there are also people who appear very successful on the outside. They may have their own business. They may be making good money, but on the inside still really struggle with, I don't know who I am. I feel terrible. They might still have a lot of those consequences of growing up in that traumatizing environment. And for years and years, I would read books on trauma and narcissism, and I went into a graduate program in clinical psychology, and reading all the theories and all of that, and I'm like, none of this really fits what I experienced in my life. Some of it's close, but narcissism is something that oftentimes, I hear people ask questions when I talk about effigism. It's like, well, isn't that just narcissism? It's like, no, it's not. And narcissism is a different thing. It can have some similar consequences on the sense of self, but there are also some differences, some real differences between effigism and narcissism. But I struggled for a long time because I'm like, is this just trauma? Is this just emotional neglect? Is this sadism? Is this narcissism? Because it's like, have I just been gaslit? what could really explain what I am experiencing, because what I'm experiencing is real, and I've been gifted or cursed with an exquisite sense of observation and a felt sense of what's happening, and it has made me a very, very effective therapist. But as somebody who grew up in a home where there was a lot of this emotional neglect and an effigistic parent and all of that kind of stuff, it's like all of that stuff I just felt very, very acutely. So I really struggled for a long time to figure out what this whole thing is, what this experience is, because none of the other labels really seemed to fit it. And when I sat down to write a script for a video that I was going to put up on YouTube that was all about emotional cruelty towards children. And at the time I thought, there's something here that feels like it needs to be said. And when I sat down to start writing that script about emotional cruelty towards children, something opened up inside me, and I didn't stop writing for 3 days. And what came out, what emerged, was this whole model of Effigism. I had been, for 40 years, had been searching for an explanation of what I had experienced growing up. And for whatever reason, one day when I sat down to write the script for a video about emotional cruelty, all of a sudden it was like everything that I had learned, all of my experiences in the clinic, everything that I had experienced throughout my life, all snapped together into one package. And I'm like, oh my God, this is it. This is exactly it. So if you're finding this conversation helpful, head over to my Substack. You'll find the link in the description below. And there you'll find articles and videos and chats, conversations, questions and answers, and all of that sort of thing, just so you can learn more about this and ways to understand how it is affecting your life and ways that you can heal and grow. So we'll see you over there. In certain families, there is a parent who is very wounded, and how they manage their own sense of self, how they manage their own panic and fear of being exposed, of being incompetent, of being wrong, is that they have to take somebody else, and whether that's a partner or a child, and place them in a failed state. And they don't realize they're doing it. This is an unconscious thing. I mean, it's not like, I don't believe my father, who's an Effigist, I don't believe that he ever just sat there and said, how can I mess up my kid's life? In fact, I sincerely believe that there was a large part of him that wanted to be a good father, because his own father was horrible to him. And so he wanted to be a good father. But unfortunately, there was a part of him that was so wounded, that was so broken, and that he did not have the capacity to see. He could not look inward and really get in touch with his own woundedness. And so instead, what he did is he had to take somebody else and put them in a position of failure, put them in a position where they were wrong and humiliated and all of that. as a way of protecting himself from experiencing his own trauma. And that component of the need of putting somebody in a failed state is what differentiates effigism from narcissism. With a narcissistic parent, the wound is not about I am terrified of being incompetent. I'm terrified of not knowing. I'm terrified of being wrong, because when that happened growing up, that's when I was punished, I was mocked, I was humiliated, and that so wounded me that I start to panic when I'm starting to feel exposed, and so I have to attack and put somebody else in that failed state to protect myself from being exposed and humiliated. With a narcissist, the wound is oftentimes I wasn't seen, I wasn't valued, I didn't matter, and because I cannot look inward to address that directly in here, my wound in here, I have to recruit others to mirror how much I am seen, how valuable I am, how much I'm the center of attention, and how and so with a narcissist, they tend to be much more charismatic. They tend to kind of recruit an entourage, right? They tend to be the person everybody knows. They're the person everybody seems to love, until you get close to them. And then you soon realize that once you're close to a narcissist, your only value to the narcissist is what you can provide to them to help stabilize their own sense of self and to elevate them. And with effigism, it's a different deal. The effigist doesn't need that adulation. They don't need that same I need to be seen. What they need is they need to be protected from that sense of being wrong, of feeling humiliated, of feeling stupid. And so they will take another person and put them into that failed state. And interestingly, I just wrote an article that I put on my Substack that is all about institutional effigism. And while this is a little bit of a slightly different pattern, you also see this in the corporate environment, where somebody who's an effigist will oftentimes have an assistant or some kind of subordinate that it doesn't matter who's in that position becomes a container for the failed state. So no matter who comes in, all of a sudden it's like there's always shifting priorities. They don't get the resources that they need. They're constantly criticized or made to feel stupid about not doing things right or not getting things out fast enough. And it's like they're intentionally put into this failed state. And that is a very different thing than what a narcissist does. Because a narcissist doesn't need somebody in a failed state. They need somebody in a mirroring state, somebody who will mirror them as being, awesome and seen and valued, and that, attention is organized around them. And that's very different from effigism. And much to my surprise, when that whole concept of effigism came out of my brain and I just wrote all this down, I was like, certainly this has been described somewhere. I mean, with all of the people in psychodynamic theory, much of this is kind of psychodynamic, and, people in the trauma research side and the attachment research side, certainly this thing has been described before. And much to my surprise, it hasn't. And so that's what made me first decide to sit down and just after I wrote that paper, I just sat down in front of the camera and I turned on the camera and I just, off the cuff, just started talking about effigism. And that first video went viral. And the number of comments that people sent me, both on the video, I mean, I've had like 1,200 comments just on that one video in a couple of weeks. And some of the stories where people would talk about how they would watch the video over and over again and weep. And the number of people who were just like, this is the first time that I have ever heard somebody put language to my experience. That really touched me, and that moved me in a very significant way. Because for the first time, all of your comments made me feel seen and understood as well. That really made me realize that, you know what, I'm not just some nut job that doesn't really fit into any of these buckets, right? There is this other thing that exists that nobody else has described, and that is my life. That has been my life story. And once I really articulated that and put that out, I come to find that that is really the life story of many people. I lost count of the number of people who were like, yeah, my therapist said that my parent was a narcissist. And it's like, yeah, it kind of fit, kind of didn't. Not, all of these labels, and I'd read all these books and nothing really seemed to quite click. And then I heard your conversation on Effigism, and it was like this moment of clarity came, and it was like, that is exactly it. That is exactly it. And because of that, because of, not only me figuring that out, finally coming to this conclusion, literally 3 weeks ago now is when I came up with the concept of Effigism. Since then, the response to this has just absolutely exploded. I have been having other psychologists and all that. They're just like, oh my God, this is fascinating. There is something really to this, and are really encouraging this. And the number of people who are reaching out and commenting and sharing the videos and all of that. Who knew that this would go viral and that so many people would resonate at such a deep level? And so what this made me, what this really led me to understand is that, Effigism is a thing. It's a real thing. And just because it hasn't been identified prior to me, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And in fact, not only does it totally make sense, and I've been writing, in addition to that first paper, which I've submitted for publication in New Ideas in Psychology, which is a APA peer-reviewed journal. I've written several other articles, and there's just going to be a stream of stuff that's getting published. And one of the things that you are going to learn if you follow this channel and go to my Substack and all of that, is that this explains the concept of Effigism, can explain a lot of things that otherwise just didn't make sense. It's like, why would a boss actively undermine their employee, right? And just saying, oh, they're a jerk, that's unsatisfactory, because clearly there's something going on there, right? Why would a parent undermine their child? And as soon as their child started expressing some competency, started developing some independence and differentiation, Why would the parent do whatever they could to try to mock, ridicule, undercut them, triangulate other people to see them as being wrong and see them as being the sick one and all of that kind of stuff? It's like, why would they do that? Is this sadism? And, it's like, no, it's not. I mean, sadism is more about taking pleasure in the infliction of pain on another, but it doesn't matter who. When it comes to things like narcissism and effigism, there's a specific person, right, or a couple people. And with an effigist, it's like no, it's that person, or in an institution, right, where there's a manager. It's like it's that position that needs to be the effigistic position, where that needs to be the failed state position. And so as soon as that person just gives up and quits and the next person comes in, then it's just continuing to recreate that failed state in that person, right? But there is a positional thing that happens with effigism where it's like, I need to keep somebody in a failed state. And as a child who's experiencing that, it can just be incredibly confusing, because you're like, why is this happening? What did I do wrong? I don't understand. What I'm doing the things that I thought I was supposed to do, why aren't you happy for me that I am growing up, or that I suddenly did something cool, or that I'm a strong enough person where I can question something that you said? Why was that met with an attack? Why did you just try to undermine me? Why did you, it feels like, why are you trying to kill my soul? And when we understand the mechanism of effigism, where the effigist needs to have you in that failed state in order to stabilize their own broken sense of self. And there's more to it than that, but that's essentially what's going on, right? Then it's all of a sudden, it's like, now everything makes sense. Now I can understand why. And it also makes sense on why the people who come out of those situations, who grow up in an effigistic home, have such a hard time identifying their sense of self or their sense of value, and are oftentimes putting themselves in positions where they continually get hurt, or they're mocked and belittled or undermined and all of those kinds of things. And that just kind of becomes the pattern of their life, because that is the self, I should say, the lack of the self. That is the way they learned how to orient themselves to the world. And until you can understand and see that pattern, it is very hard to break out of that. But once you understand, it's like, oh, this is why I'm feeling this way. This is why I'm doing this particular thing. Once you have some clarity around why you're doing certain things because of growing up in this household, that provides a framework to make sense out of where some of your behaviors are coming from, why you are feeling some of the things that you're feeling. And then once you have some clarity, then it's like, now I can start developing a strategy for how to build my life in a more positive way, where it's like, oh, you know what? This is a pattern that I get into with people, where I need to be the rescuer, or I just give in the hopes that they will give back to me, or that they will see me as valuable. And once we can see those patterns, then we're better able to address them and come up with strategies for moving forward in a healthier way in our life. And by doing that, then we can finally start healing that sense of self and developing those parts of ourselves that just really didn't happen, just really didn't develop in childhood. Welcome to the new mailbag section where I take a stab at answering some of the questions that you're either posting in the YouTube comments or on my Substack or through messaging me. And the first one comes from Julie, who asks, isn't Effigism just scapegoating? And they are different, but that's a very fair question. With scapegoating, oftentimes what a family will do is, instead of looking at their own dysfunction, they will try to lay all the blame on one person. So it's Uncle Bob, or it's one of the sons or daughters or one of the cousins who is the reason why the family is struggling. And if they would just be better, if they weren't doing all of their bad stuff, then somehow the family would be happy, joyous, and free. And it is a way of diverting attention and responsibility away from the self and placing it on another person. With Effigism, it's a little bit different, because there is an effigist needs another to help them manage their own sense of self. They need to protect themselves from their own fear of feeling incompetent, or feeling like they don't know anything, or feeling humiliated. And because they lack a sense of insight into their own woundedness, so to speak, they need to put another person into a failed state in order to elevate themselves kind of by contrast. It says, I'm not the failed one. I'm not the bad one. I'm not the incompetent one. It's you. In an organization, it's, the secretary or my assistant or my colleague is the reason why I can't perform. And in a family system, there is this, I need you to be in a failed state so I can feel better about myself, and I'm not exposed as being a fraud, so to speak, or incompetent, or that I don't know what I'm doing, because history has shown me that is the source of my greatest pain. That is when I have been punished the most or humiliated the most. And so in order to protect myself, I need to put somebody else into a failed state where I undermine their sense of self. And in a scapegoat, that's usually more of a family system kind of thing, and they don't necessarily actively undermine the person. They just lay blame on them. Dan asks, why do they need me to fail? And that's actually similar to another question by Becky, who asked, why does the effigist sabotage my success? And I'll kind of answer both of those. And we talked about that really in with the last question, is that an effigist, the thing that is the most terrifying for an effigist is to be exposed as being incompetent, as being a failure, as being stupid. And they will do anything to protect themselves from that. And whenever somebody, particularly within an attachment relationship, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be, but usually, at least within a family system, it is somebody where there's an some emotional connection or a very close proximity. And they need to keep that person in a failed state so that they don't become competent and reveal how incompetent that I am. And I know it sounds incredibly unhealthy, but that's kind of what the deal is. That's why the effigist will sabotage you. Will intentionally. I shouldn't say intentionally. They will actively do things to undermine your sense of self and your success in order to keep you in a failed state. And the reason why I wanted to be careful about the whole word intent is that, like with narcissists, even though their behavior, they actively do things, there's not always a real appreciation for exactly what they're doing. I mean, they don't really realize that they are creating this broken person. It's like that thought doesn't come into their mind. They don't, so there's not like a pre-planned, how can I make my child's life terrible? It's just that they are just reacting from their own trauma, and their own woundedness knocks them out of the driver's seat of their own life, and they start behaving in ways that are very destructive toward another person. And then at other times when those trauma reactions subside and the normal person kind of returns, they may act like a decent parent, right? They may actively like want to, make sure we've got good clothes and, that we have access to opportunities and things like that. And that's one of the things that can be so confusing. But even an effigistic parent, even a narcissistic parent, can do most things right most of the time. But it's in those moments where we have some vulnerability and we are reaching out to them or we are engaging them in some way, and their own woundedness gets triggered and they retaliate in a very damaging way, that it doesn't really matter that 90% of the time or 75% of the time or 50% of the time they act like, decent human beings, because, just acting like a decent human being should be kind of the default. But it's those moments of damage that happen that really impact us and leave a real long-lasting effect. So the last question comes from Pete, who asks, can an effigist change? And I don't think so. Because like with narcissism, borderline personality disorder, antisocial, any of the the real personality disorders, there is a way that the mind organizes or orients themselves to the world, and one component of that is a lack of the ability to look inward and have insight into their own emotional process. And so when you try to talk to somebody who is an effigist, or you talk to somebody who's a narcissist, or somebody that is borderline or antisocial, and you try to get them to get in touch with what is being triggered, right? What is happening in here when you see somebody do something that is causing you to have a response? And if they're even willing to sit with that for a moment and try to look inward, they just sit there with just kind of a blank, and they're just like, well, if everybody wasn't doing it, or it's their fault, or if my kid would only blah blah blah. They have to externalize it again, because there's just not that sense of internal connection, and that without that internal sense of awareness, there just really isn't an opportunity to grow, right? Because you can't evolve if you're not in touch with where your own sensitivities are, where your own triggers are, because then once you get triggered, you need to be able to identify that. What's being affected? How am I normally behaving? And is there a different way that I can respond to this? All right, everybody, thank you very much for joining me in this very first episode of the new Dr. Todd Show. I hope you found this valuable, and I look forward to seeing you next week, next Sunday to be exact. Have a great week, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.